Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all viewers from all around the world. My name is Frank van den Driest. I work with the Institute for Real Growth. The Institute for Real Growth features weekly humanized growth series webinars, and that's what we're doing now. The purpose of the Institute is to help chief marketing officers and other growth leaders drive more humanized growth by connecting them to peers, to thought leaderships, and to experts. And that's, again, exactly what we're going to do in the next hour. I have with me Andrew Clarke, Global President of Mars Wrigley. And let me tell you a little bit about Mars. Mars has been around for more than 100 years. They count over 125,000 associates, as they call them. And the businesses cover pet care, food, Edge, and then Mars Wrigley. So, Andrew, you're a lifer at Mars. You spent the first 20 years in category and sales leadership roles, then became the chief customer officer of Mars Global. And then a bit later, you also added the CMO job to that, which is a really interesting perspective. And then 2 years ago, you became the global president for all of Mars Wrigley. So in the next hour, we're going to talk about your view on growth from a perspective of a very large family-owned company. We'll also talk about today's role and the opportunity for marketing. Especially interesting to hear from you, your perspective that is, as said, has this more sales and general management perspective. So I think it was about 6 years or so that we met. We were both invited by WPP for a tour through Silicon Valley. And we basically visited all of the big tech players. The only thing I forgot to do was buy some shares at that time. But anyway, very warm welcome, Andrew. Great to have you here. And let me start by asking you, where are you and how are you?
Hi, Frank. Hi, everyone. Yes, I'm well, thank you. I'm sitting here as we speak in Chicago, which is the home of Mars Wrigley. I'm sitting in this very same room, probably like many of you on the call, been in the same room for the last 6 months. Feels like I haven't left the room, actually. Although I have to say, Frank, your home office looks a lot more interesting than my home office. But I'm pleased to say I'm doing well. Family doing well. Children are back to school, I'm delighted to say. And very much looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, great. Well, actually, this used to be my office, but then my wife is a therapist, and she basically kicked me out. So this is a room that sees a lot of emotions. Hence the punch bag there in the back. But so Andrew, what I remember from that trip through Silicon Valley is that we visited quite a lot of companies. And I wrote a note to all the people working with the consultancy I was working at the time. And I said that I had expected to learn a lot and to, share insights on technology and latest developments on AI, etc. However, the thing that struck me most from that trip was the fact that we visited some very clear overperformers, but we also visited the likes of Yahoo and others that are either not around anymore or having very tough times. And I noticed there were three very fundamental differences between the overperformers we visited and the laggards. And the overperformers were all super ambitious, almost aggressive, but at the same time, they were also humble. I remember Phil Schindler from Google saying, we're positively paranoid, like never underestimating, what's coming in our back. And the third element was that they were extremely clear about their purpose. Everybody knew, any moment they would be woken up in the night, what they would go to work for or what their company stood for. So I don't know if you recognize that, but from that trip, but I'm mostly interested to hear from you to what extent these three characteristics apply to the Mars Wrigley business?
I agree with you. It was an incredibly insightful trip, Frank. I can't believe it's 6 years already. I mean, I think it's a great question. I think in simple terms, I would start with Mars Inc. rather than Mars Wrigley. And I would say I absolutely recognise it. This is a business that's been around, as you said, for well over 100 years. And the founders were truly entrepreneurial, still a family business today. And I think that really permeates all the way through the DNA. So I think the courage, the long-term thinking, the clarity of vision and purpose, the ability to really stay the course, and indeed the humbleness. I mean, I totally recognise that. And, for what it's worth, in many ways, that's the reason I've stayed for 20 years at Mars. That's ability to make a difference for the long run.
So how much of your time do you spend nurturing or fostering those characteristics at Mars Wrigley?
I mean, literally every day, every moment, every interaction. I think the business is founded on 5 principles. I'm sure you're well aware of that. I'm sure many of the listeners or viewers are well aware of that in Mars. And the history of the 5 principles is pretty incredible, actually. So it goes back to 1947, I believe, and a letter that was written by Forrest Sr. at the time, who was running the business. And he talked about a mutuality of benefits and services. And in many ways, that was ahead of his time. You think back to 1947 and where we are today. And really his vision was about stakeholders across the whole chain, if you like, not just profit, but stakeholders, whether that's consumers, customers, even competitors, associates, as we call them. And I think that sort of mutuality as a principle has really shone through everything. We call it sort of mutuality of economics now. And that really permeates everything we do day in and day out, Frank.
Yeah, I read it actually in preparing for, so actually we decided to take that, the work that you did, Said Business School of the Oxford University is also a partner to the Institute for Real Growth. So we actually, I sent immediately this economics of mutuality. So we're going to probably offer our leadership program a deep dive on that. Find that huge.
Funny enough, just literally this week, ironically, related to this, we've literally just announced Mutuality of Economics Foundation, which we're working with the Oxford Business School in, and actually Stephen Badger, one of the family members, ex-chair of the board, still a board member, he'll be chairing that non-for-profit foundation. So good timing. Good to partner.
That is very good timing. That we just signed the United Nations Global Compact as a new partner to the Institute, and also that gives access to great thought leadership. But this would surely be a great addition. So I remember from visiting the Mars offices over the years as a consultant in the most of times, like any office, factory, whatever, you always see this plaquette with these 5 principles or values. You call them principles, but so have they remained the same over time?
Well, I mean, the other thing I would say is that it's not just in every single facility. There's literally in every single office on the wall with the 5 principles. And for those Mars associates and others on the call, you'll recognise that, I'm sure. So they're very much alive and well today across geographies, across cultures, across businesses, across generations, really. And that's what unites our 125,000 associates and indeed all of our partners externally as well. So very, very much alive and well and very much permeating the way we do business today. I think just for the listeners, the 5 are, I mean, easy to look these up. Quality, efficiency, mutuality, responsibility, and freedom. And I think the 2 most distinctive, we talked a little bit about mutuality, but the other one for me that's distinctive is the freedom element, given we're a private business for 100 plus years.
Yeah, I find that super interesting. I had a great conversation with Michael Breen. He's the CEO and founder of Human Rights First. And he said, we talked a lot about purpose, his personal passion and purpose. And because I think why people do what they do is often driven by what they're passionate about. And he said, well, Frank, purpose changes over time. My values they're rock solid, that won't change. Is that something that, even on like a personal level, that you would agree with? Or do you see that as you mature through life, your value set changes?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, a chicken and egg question in some ways. I think the principles, as I've just said, have been the foundation of Mars for decades now. But actually, I would argue that the purpose, even though we've articulated it much more sharply in the last couple of years, I would argue that the purpose really was what drove that. So this sort of mutuality of benefits, mutuality of economics, if you like. I think that's been the guiding purpose of Mars, and that still very much is this sort of long-term vision, this ability to make a difference across generations, to create a business that is doing better in society. And I think in today's world, that's, I would argue, more relevant than ever. We go through, all going through COVID, all the difficult times that that's providing, creating for us, and calling into question a lot of capitalism in many ways. And I think this sort of mutuality of economics, probably ahead of its time in 1947. Arguably, we haven't cracked it today as we sit here today in 2020, but I think it's asking a lot of questions about big businesses like ours and our responsibility to do the right thing in the world. So I would argue it's both. I mean, having clear principles is obviously vital, but I do think we've always had that clear purpose as well, which we've now articulated much more sharply to enable our associates to rally behind.
Yeah, that was exactly what I just want to talk about next, is that purpose. I wrote down, we believe the world we want tomorrow starts with how we do business today. That is the articulation of the Mars purpose, right? So is there one Mars purpose, or do the different, like food and Mars Wrigley, have different purposes? The brands have different purposes?
This is a good case study as well. So yes, and yes is the answer. Although they all ladder back to the Mars Inc. purpose you've just shared. As CMO, I worked on that purpose in 2017, which we launched in 2018, 2019, and that's resonated very well with our associates across the business, and it enables us as a private business to be, I think, much more vocal externally as well. But to answer your question, actually the the segment businesses that we have their own purposes. So I worked in pet care for 10 years, as you're probably aware. Proud to be in Mars Wrigley now, but pet care, better world for pets. And that ladders very nicely up into the Mars Inc. purpose. The Mars Wrigley purpose, better moments, more smiles, again, links nicely together. And then, as you say, going all the way down into the brands, picking the brands, making sure that they authentically stand for something. Great example is Pedigree, Feed the Good, and what's come from that ladders all the way back to Better World for Pets and the Mars Inc. purpose. So that's the ideal when we get it right, and authenticity, of course, is key all the way through that.
Hey, and so the literature on purpose almost always has at some point where they say, well, leaders, and actually all employees or associates, as you call them, should align their own purpose with the business they work with, or vice versa. They should be aligned. To what extent is that the case for you? I mean, did you define your own purpose in life? Like, did you really articulate? Have you ever articulated that, or like a space?
I'd sound super smart if I said yes, but I think in reality this evolves, and I think when I reflect over my 20 years with Mars, as I said a few minutes ago, the reason why I've stayed, one of the primary reasons why I've stayed, I think, is that personal fit with Mars, with the 5 principles and how we do business. Yes, over the course of the 20 years, I've been the beneficiary of some brilliant leadership training, and of course that's helped to define my purpose. I'm sure many of us have done that, and yes, that ladders very nicely to what we're trying to create in Mars. And put simply for me, this is about the ability to make a difference in the world, make a difference with the teams that I lead, the associates that I work with. We're all in service of building a better business and a better legacy and a better business that I can then hand over to my successor. So that's how I would proudly articulate it, Frank. And I think very important for us is to make sure our leaders, but also all of our associates, have the ability to to feel themselves, to be themselves, bring their best of themselves to Mars and our business, and to live the purpose. And I think that's if you get that right, it really unlocks some brilliant creativity all the way through the business.
I remember presenting at I had worked with Fiona Hughes on the Whiskas brand purpose, and we came to the beautiful nurture the cats through nature. And I remember that the CEO, I forgot his name at the time, and basically all of the board were there, and all the brand leaders had to present their progress on purpose work. And I remember that I asked him, do you feel that purpose for these brands is an add-on or an integral part of let's say, what the brand is all about? And basically, the conclusion was that we agreed to disagree on the answer to that. But what would your answer be, Andrew, to that?
So the CEO at the time, I think, was Paul Michaels. Going back in the day, I was in pet care at the time, many years ago. I think we've got some brilliant examples where it's completely congruent. Yeah. Whiskas is a good example. Pedigree is a good example. The work we've done on Maltesers is a great example. Skittles even on the Mars Wrigley side. But we haven't got it for every single brand. And there's still more opportunities to make sure we get that real authenticity right, what each individual brand stands for. So my answer would say, yes, ideally you can make it work. And when you get it right, it's magic. I'm sure, plenty of CMOs on the call would agree with that. There's some fantastic case studies. I would say probably the one that resonates the most to me is Pedigree. I mentioned that before. I worked in pet care for 10 years. But I won't labour a case study. That's not really the point of this conversation. And the case study is available to read. But I think it's a brilliant example of taking what still is one of our biggest brands, but was struggling for relevancy with consumers in an increasingly commoditized space, and getting super clear on what the purpose stood for, the guardrails, the archetype, the brand compass, but particularly the purpose, has driven a whole host of creativity all the way through the business. And again, without labouring it, now multi-award winning and getting fantastic growth. So some brilliant stories when we get it right, but it has to be authentic, and that of course takes time. I think that the other beauty, long answer, Frank, the other beauty if you get this right, of course, is it gives you so much freedom. So in the COVID times when, of course, it turned on its head for all of us how we generate creative, our ability to respond quickly. For example, our Maltesers campaign in the UK, or what we did with Snickers, because we were crystal clear on what the brand stands for, it gave us real permission and the local markets permission to move quickly without asking questions about whether this was right or wrong. So I think it's had a multiplier effect across the business as a result.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So to what extent are you involved, because you oversee the whole of the business, in the brands, their purpose, and activating those purposes? To what extent is that something that you involve yourself with?
Yeah, of course. Now in Mars Wrigley, I still take a keen interest and I guess a sponsorship role for marketing across Mars Inc. As part of the leadership team, working very closely with the other CMOs, Jane in pet care, Rafa in food, for example, Catherine, now our Chief Growth Officer in Mars Wrigley. So take a keen interest across the business, but of course for Mars Wrigley, absolutely. The brands are, it's cliche, but the lifeblood of the business. We have to continually make our brands relevant and reinvent them. We've got 5 of our brands that are above $1 billion, which is amazing in Mars Wrigley, 11 in Mars Inc., 5 in Mars Wrigley. And we've got many others that have got potential to grow to that sort of level. So absolutely I do. And I'm very proud of the marketing teams, the marketing talent that we've got in the business, actually across the business. It gives us a real competitive advantage. That combined with the long-term agency partnerships we've got. So the simple answer is yes. And then in addition, with Grant Reed, our CEO, myself, Jane, the other CMOs, we will review the brands, a bit like your example with Paul Michaels and Whiskas. We'll have a yearly session, if not a 6-monthly session, but certainly a yearly session where we'll get really into the creative. And that serves a number of purposes, actually. It's I think above anything else, it gives a real connection point for our brilliant marketing associates to be proud of the work that they've done, and allows Grant and I to sort of connect the dots across the the wider organisation. So yes, Frank, absolutely.
Hey, and so let me throw in $1 million question. Growth. How do you define growth?
Personally or as a business?
As a business.
As a business. I mean, I'm pleased to say this is one that we've got real alignment on. Over the last 5 years, we've got increasing clarity on. And this is critical, of course, for any business, but for a family business, from the owners to the next generations down. So generation 4 really are on the board now. 6 members of generation 4 are board members, 2 from each branch of the family. Making sure that the board is aligned with our vision of growth and, of course, the businesses. And the way we define it, to answer your question, really 4 dimensions. Firstly, strong financial performance. I think every business, of course, would have that. And, of course, if you don't have strong financial performance, you can't do anything else. So that's the freedom element. Secondly, quality of growth. And the double click here is making sure that our brands, our markets, the categories in which we operate are in tailwinds. They're in areas that are going to grow. They're in areas that are relevant for the consumers of the future. And how we're creating new businesses, new brands, making our existing brands relevant for quality growth is the second area. And perhaps more interestingly, because those 2 are, I guess, obvious for most on the call. The other 2 areas, which again bring the sort of mutuality of economics, this long-term vision to life, are what we call trusted partner. So how trusted are we with all the stakeholders that I mentioned before? Our associates, particularly our associates starting there, but also our suppliers, our customers, our distributors, NGOs, etc. So what's the trust level with our partnerships? And then finally, how do we make sure we make a positive societal impact where sustainability fits? In my case, cocoa's key, so cocoa for generations, making sure we do the right thing for the long run. So that's the definition across those 4 areas. And actually our long-term incentive as a senior leadership team is balanced across those 4. And that leads to some very difficult trade-off conversations, as you can well imagine. But it also means that we can be true to our purpose. We can be true to the shareholders' ambitions of where we take Mars for the long run.
It's interesting. That's a clear and great answer, Andrew. But what I find really interesting is that you start with the financial performance. Actually, I myself believe that that financial performance is actually a result of the other 3. So, but this is where, also in our leadership program, we have a lot of discussion around. So people, well, the leadership, they say all the right things, but in the end of the day, 90% of the conversations are you going to make next quarter's budget? And that's what the pressure is on. And I'm afraid, I think Mars is not an exception to that. Whereas, philosophically, but actually when I owned my own company, also very practically, we said the KPIs were not on the turnover, on the profit, but on the quality of the client relationships, etc. All the things you mentioned. I just read the other day that the CEO of Taobao in China, the huge, let's say, commerce platform, that the key KPI is not the amount of turnover, it's the number of jobs created through the platform, because this allows people to set up their own store. So I think the order question here is really important. It is, it's to do with how much time do you spend, on your, town halls that you undoubtedly do every so many times. How much do you talk about the top line, the bottom line, and how much do you talk about quality of relationship, partnerships, the things you just mentioned? And do you steer on the right order? How do you see that, Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of what I've just described is the tension between the 4. I think, as Grant, our CEO, would say, purpose without performance is you can't do it. So you've got to have the strong financial performance. It's critical, and that's critical for the future as well, of course. We've been around for 100 plus years. How are we around for another 100 plus years? We absolutely need that financial freedom to stay private. So financial performance is key, but then it's then what we choose to do with that financial performance, that strong financial performance. And that's where the other three components are critical, where we invest for the long run. Do we stay the course? Do we do the difficult things that are the right things for the long run, whether that's facing into the cocoa challenges in the supply chain, a generational challenge like plastics and recyclable packaging? Are we putting enough money there to invest behind them? Are we building the long-term partnerships, which we do measure? And I think we would proudly say, back to that mutuality piece of, back to my CMO days out, some of our agency partnerships have been around, as you know, for decades. So these are really important artifacts of what Mars is about. But I would say, if you can argue the other way around, of course, but you've got to have strong financial performance to give you that freedom, and then it one blends off the others.
Yeah. Hey, Andrew, and just to all the viewers, there is the possibility to ask questions to Andrew. And I'm going to read the first question from Simon Weirney, an associate at Mars, in a moment. But just maybe to help the audience, Andrew, what question should they really not ask you?
I would just go for it, Frank. This is a nice fireside chat, so let's go for it. And when there's a very difficult question, I'll say that's the one. Don't ask me that one.
Exactly.
And I'm hoping Simon, given he's an associate, he's not going to ask me that question. So let's see.
No, he does have a question related to the growth. That's why I come to it. He asks, he says basically, he talks about the challenges with regards to technology. And the changing ways we manage supply chains. And he wants to know about the role of human technology partnerships from a perspective of greater need to upskill and train associates, of the new ways of working and new technology shaping those processes. How do you have a view on this?
Yeah. And of course, we're all learning every day on this as the world changes so rapidly. Lots of angles to this one, Simon and Frank and everyone. I think, firstly, I would say that Mars Inc., Mars Wrigley is on a very fast digitization journey, as many businesses are, of course. I was fortunate as CMO to be I was sort of thrown into that very difficult phase of turbulence when digital was really ramping up, as when we were together, as you said, in the West Coast. And we've made a number of very significant investments, boosts in talent, external hires, and really looked at a number of our partnerships to give us that best blend to then enable us to move forward. So, for example, Sandeep, who joined us as Chief Digital Officer, has been a brilliant disruptor and a brilliant collaborator. He's attracted some fantastic talent into the digital business, but also the business units, and then the collaboration with each of the business units to enable us to move forward across the whole value chain has been incredible. And a lot of this then, back to the human side, is how do we, of course, bringing talent from the outside where we need it, where we don't have the capabilities. We've just made a senior hire in media, for example, into my team to try and boost us in that area. But also, how do we reskill our existing teams, and how does technology enable us? And that, I'm pleased to say, goes across the whole supply chain. So from our factory associates, it enables us to do training, AI trainers, virtual reality training, particularly in COVID times, which has been brilliant from home to improve our safety, as an example. Actually, interestingly, through COVID, because of all the extra steps we put in place, plus the safety culture we've had, we've got the lowest ever safety issues. I know you're only as good as your last shift, but it just shows you what's possible, turning sort of adversity into a positive, which is quite interesting. And then as you go across the business, we're really trying to put in place different ways of working. So if I look at my team, we put in place a very different way to innovate. How do we put in agile teams dedicated to innovation projects, working on sprints, metered funding, enabled by digital and data, which is a very different way of working. And actually many of our marketing and R&D associates are exactly the same associates as before, but finding a new energy and working in different ways. So I think it's a combination of testing and learning, sprinting, bringing in expertise, and then all in service of reinventing the business. So it's a great question. And I wouldn't say we've cracked it completely, but we're seeing some fantastic progress and some great green shoots across the business.
So, and you mentioned the chief digital officers, and you have all these digital transformations happening in basically all companies that I know of. And I think that the way I look at it is that basically any digital transformation that doesn't put the customer journey at its very heart is a missed opportunity. It doesn't say that it can't be successful. It can't lead to, I don't know, increased efficiencies or something, but it's just a missed opportunity. And so also the CMOs in our program, we talk about what the role is and how you make sure you're in the driver's seat or next to the driver's seat as a marketing function, with, being the voice of the outside world and the customer very specifically, or consumer, I should say. To what extent is marketing indeed like deeply involved or in the driver's seat of these digital transformations happening in Mars?
Totally. By the way, it's a good point. I failed to mention on my last answer, really, the user centricity elements, consumer centricity, as we would call it, or customer journey, as you would call it, is fundamental. And actually, Sandeep's been ruthless on that. So any investment has to follow a consumer and a use case, and then driving a test and learn agenda. So that's absolutely another component to Simon's question. So I think from a CMO marketing perspective, absolutely fundamental, I would say. And this is the big advantage I had, or challenge I had moving into the CMO role, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, was the timing of that was hugely challenging, but very energizing as well, given the level of disruption that was happening. And I think, as we play that forwards, the role of our CMOs now as being architects of growth, but real change agents for the future, being able to bring all of the external confusion into the business and make sense of that, and then turn that into compelling strategies with a bias for action is absolutely how I would see the CMO role. And if I look at the CMOs we've now got, there's some brilliant examples, not just the CMOs actually, but all the way through the business, of partnerships with the digital teams that we've got in the businesses. And to give you a couple of examples, we had Clarence Mack, who was our CMO for food. I'm delighted to say he's now in my team. So we've moved Clarence into president for China. And he's bringing all of his knowledge of marketing, digital and disruption in our most disruptive market, which is really helping us to reinvent China. I'll take another CMO. Many of you know Leonid Sudakov, who was the CMO for our pet care business. He's now moved into the president of Kinship, part of our pet care ecosystem, and is bringing a lot of digital disruption and leading it there. So I really see the CMO role as being that growth architect, that translator, but very importantly, that ability to then drive change through the business.
So again, as I mentioned at the beginning, you have more a sales and general management perspective typically. So I hear that a lot of things go really well at Mars Wrigley. What is the most important pitfall for marketers? Maybe not per se at Mars Wrigley. Let's just say more broadly. What's the biggest watch out? I mean, what's the one thing that you're always pushing marketers to do less or more of?
Yeah, it's a great question, Frank. I think I do have a slightly different vantage point, I guess, versus the majority on the call. And, I would consider myself at best to be a business marketeer who fortunately then was into the CMO role with more of a customer and general management background. I think the advantage I had then was to be able to ask the obvious questions, the difficult questions, and to drive more of a disruptive agenda, I think, a change agenda across the business. So I think my encouragement for all CMOs, Catherine, our Chief Growth Officer now in Mars Wrigley, the brilliant talent we've got through the business is to think enterprise and to really break the silos across the business. And if there's one function that has the ability to do that, it's marketing. Because marketing is at the heart of everything, the heart of the consumer, of course, and touches pretty much every function. And I still find at times that we have opportunities to connect the dots better. And I just encourage all the CMOs to really take that sort of broader leadership, growth architect piece, break the silos, and create the environment to drive change.
Can you give a very practical, actionable example of that? What was an intervention that one of these CMOs, either in Mars Wrigley or outside, that you would say, this is the kind of stuff that really breaks down the barriers? Because that is one thing that everybody recognizes as probably the biggest barrier to growth. Bain did a study on it, and I don't remember, it's like 90% or so of the CEOs said the biggest barrier to growth is ourselves, is our internal dysfunction, and that always comes down back to those silos. So what have you seen, or maybe an example you did yourself, that was so effective in breaking down those silos?
Yeah, I think when you use the examples, in some ways they sound so obvious. You say, well, why were we not doing that before? And yet the multiplier effect of doing this is enormous. So I'll give you a very current example, actually. So it's probably best to pick China in some of these cases, because China is so much further ahead, certainly in our business, in terms of digitizing and working with data, working with different platforms. And what Clarence and his team have been able to do very recently is combine a number of factors together. So I take M&M's as our biggest brand in Mars Wrigley. We have a store in Shanghai, an M&M's World store in Shanghai. We have a very good sized brand. It's not our biggest brand in China, actually. Dove is our biggest brand, but it's still a good sized brand. We have an innovation facility. We have our factory supply network. We have brilliant customer partnerships with Alibaba, Tencent, and others. And we've got the best sales force coverage versus anyone, with probably the exception of Coke. And yet I didn't feel that all of those elements were connected up enough. And what we've been able to do recently is, with some of our innovations on M&M's, is literally connect the whole ecosystem up with data at the center, with consumer at the center, working out how we innovate with an Alibaba, a Tmall platform, very much linked to our stores, driving additional traffic, and then linking that all the way through our digital ecosystem, all the way through to our route to market, so our O2O, online to offline, all the way through to our sales force to be able to drive an execution. And again, when I say that, it sounds so obvious, but to be able to do that, you need the vision, you need the partnerships, and you need the courage to drive that through. And I think Clarence, not just Clarence, all of his leadership team and some brilliant marketeers and sales guys have really driven that to the next level. So that'll be one example, Frank. I could pick plenty, but always good to pick a current one.
Good, thank you. So I want to share a question from Saffron Inkster. And the question is, what's the primacy metric of success for your brands from a marketing perspective? And how important is brand love?
Cool, it's a great question, Saffron, thank you. We've got a whole suite of metrics for our brands. I think that the most important in many ways is penetration. I'm a big believer in the laws of growth, evidence-based marketing, partnership with Ehrenberg Bass. And I know this can be controversial with some, but really making sure that our brands are relevant and continuing to be relevant for consumers of today and tomorrow. And I think where we haven't focused sufficiently on recruitment and penetration, we've sometimes lost a generation or a cohort or whatever. So continuing to make sure our brands remain relevant. And of course, trust comes into that equation. But if you ask me to pick one, it would be penetration.
Andrew, explain to me. I mean, as long, and any leader I spoke to and worked with at Mars will, at the right and sometimes also the wrong moments, start mentioning the laws of growth and the Ehrenberg Bass work. How on earth is it possible that you then forget about penetration or don't put enough attention to that? That's what I mean. Somebody who wouldn't agree with those laws probably won't have a job in Mars. Is almost the way it feels to me. Then how is it possible that this is not enough on the radar?
I didn't say it wasn't enough on the radar, Frank. I said it was it was the most important metric, and there's been occasions where we maybe lost focus. So I think it's a great question, and it's a reminder when you've got a big organisation that you need to continually have a what I would call a growth philosophy, a quality growth mindset of what that takes, because a lot of these laws are the research, the evidence-based, are maybe counterintuitive, as many of you will agree, I'm sure. And of course, as the world evolves, many questions are asked as well. You know, what happens with digital? What happens with loyalty? What happens with insurgents? What happens? Does that change the laws? Does that change the way we look at things? And what I found fascinating in my CMO time, and which I've now taken into Mars Wrigley, was the ability to again go evidence-based, to really research what's working from what I call a quality growth perspective. And what I looked at with my team at the time, yes, we had all the science-based laws of growth, our version of that, our codification. But equally, I was interested, I'm sure like you, Frank, from an Institute of Real Growth, on the behaviour side, the leadership side. And we looked at our top 60 markets, so breaking our business units down into the top 60 by scale. And we looked back 7 years in each of those units. And we looked at which units continually outperformed across 7 years versus those that went up and down, maybe went down and up, versus that flatlined. And then looked to codify what was unique about those units that managed to deliver consistent growth. And absolutely, the evidence-based was part of that. But there was 4 or 5 other things which were fascinating, including the enterprise approach, which I just talked about, breaking the silos. Uncommon collaboration with the partnerships, so really having different partnerships which help the business to be future orientated, as an example. Placing, and it sounds so obvious, but placing the bets on the growth categories and staying the course.
Yeah.
And actually we found
that would be my number one. If you would have asked me, what do you think?
Yeah.
I would have said by quite some distance, staying the course would be number one.
I think that, evidence-based, that would suggest that as well. If you go to Erin Babassi, go to Granularity of Growth or Beyond Hockey Stick, or which any of these good read would suggest stay the course. But it's still, to your point on behaviours, it's quite interesting that even though the science is there, the logic's there, often we don't do that. We don't have the courage to continually back or invest because we're looking for a short-term return, or there's something else happening, or we're overinflating an innovation that's coming, rather than saying, no, this is the area to back for the long run. So I found that fascinating. What we've done with that, a combination of what we call the laws of growth plus the behavioural leadership elements, we've combined that into a program we call Growth Legacy, which we then roll through in Mars Wrigley, all of our top markets, to then sharpen our strategies. And that's working very well for us.
Great. And that's something that you have driven. I think that sounds really interesting, this Growth Legacy approach.
Yeah, we've
program that you're pushing.
Yeah, something I'm passionate about and sponsor and continue to, but championed by the CMO group as well. And then putting some of our best talent on that. So Michael McGee, who used to run senior marketeer for Europe, now runs the program reporting through into Mars Wrigley, which is fantastic. Great.
I have a few more questions myself, but I want to do one more from the viewers. Let me see. Rebecca Lyons asked, how do you feel category leadership has helped put shopper and consumer at the heart of Mars business?
Now, if this is the Rebecca Lyons I know, she also has a good background in Mars, and a good background in category. So probably a leading question, Rebecca, but a great question. Funnily enough, my first job within Mars was category leadership. I still have a big passion that the category leadership needs to be the centerpiece for everything. Getting the portfolio strategy right with our brands linked to a category vision, and then being able to translate that through the whole business is paramount. And if we get that right, that connects everything, connects the consumer all the way back to the supplier. And we haven't always got that completely through the value chain. That's something I'm very passionate about, Rebecca, if that is the same Rebecca.
Yeah, it is. She's confirming that in writing. I want to talk a little bit more about, we talked about growth. We talked about also about what happened in Mars with Wrigley when COVID hit. By and large, so the whole philosophy of the Institute for Real Growth is helping CMOs and other growth leaders shift from a short-term capital markets focus, shareholder focus, to a long-term all stakeholders focus, including, by the way, the capital markets, but also colleagues, consumers, communities that you operate, and capital markets. What I see, let's say, in the world at large, the business world at large, is that pre-COVID, the prime focus for most companies was on capital markets and consumer. COVID happened and it shifted exactly to colleagues first and the communities, the world in which we operate. With Mars being already being family owned and having these principles that are more about mutuality and so about stakeholder value, have you seen a shift by COVID also in Mars with focus on specific stakeholders?
How would I describe this? I would probably describe this as bringing out the best of Mars in many ways. And we often say we're good in a crisis. This has been a very, very challenging time for the whole world and many of our associates and the communities, of course. And I think we've broken this into phases, like most businesses, so nothing clever in what I'm about to say, but I think we've done it in a very principled and purpose-led manner. So firstly, most importantly, protecting our associates and the communities in which they live, and making sure that our associates and the communities are safe and well and doing what we can to stop the spread. Secondly, doubling down to make sure we have continuity in our business operations. And that might sound straightforward, but like many on the call, that's hugely challenging in the global business and interconnected world. Yeah. We've had huge growth in our pet and food businesses, our ice cream business as well, keeping those raw materials going, keeping our factories running, keeping them as safe, as I mentioned earlier, as possible, and being able to still distribute our products to our customers has been key. Of course, within that, and we'll come back to this later, we've seen, as everyone's seen, huge shifts as well in transactions. So that's put an extra tension into where transactions are happening, and therefore digitization, and certainly for Mars Wrigley, of course, more planned purchases than impulse purchases, which is it's accelerated a trend that we knew was happening, and that's put us under pressure in different areas. And then I think, very significantly, how do we come through this, the sort of third phase, like every business, more strongly? How do we come out of COVID as a better business? And I think through that, there's many good examples, Frank. There's great examples of what we've done at a local level with our brands in our communities, investing in our communities, small gestures with our brands, whether that's thank you packs from M&M's or donations of extra or Easter eggs into the NHS in the UK, whatever it is, as well as monetary donations in West Africa, etc. So we've done our piece with the communities, which is great. We stood by our associates through the difficult times. And I think we're starting to learn to do things very, very differently as well, which is fascinating, which will make us better. So I'll give you one very simple example from this week. Royal Canin, our pet business, brilliant business led by Loic. We have a veterinary symposium happening literally this week. Normally we would have a few thousand veterinary practitioners attending. We've got 45,000 that have registered online as a result. So doing this in a very different way drives reach in a very different way, which helps the whole industry. And again, it's a great example of doing what's right for the long run. So honestly, I would say this has brought the best out. It's been hugely taxing. It's been a resilience test. I'm sure it has for all of the leaders on the call. I can talk about that personally, trying to juggle a family and difficult commitments, parents in another country, and friends and family elsewhere, and trying to lead a business through a very difficult change has been hugely taxing. But I think we'll all come through it more strongly, Frank. So that would be my simple answer, and it makes me proud to be part of Mars, to be honest.
Well, that's very good to hear, Andrew. Well, you mentioned in one of the comments about the shift towards digital. Actually, we spoke about in a couple of instances in the past 45 minutes. Simon Sadie, he has, hi Simon, he has a question.
This is the question. This is the question that I'm not going to answer. Just to be clear, it's from Simon. This is
no, I think it's a very good question. He says we've seen the digital age brings dangers as well as benefits. For example, the pervasive growth of hate speech, the challenge to consumer privacy as companies gather data. How do you see it as possible to embrace the growth these platforms bring, and yet at the same time maintain your principles?
Very relevant question. Thank you, Simon.
Good question.
I mean, I think principles come first, and what we stand for comes first, of course, and our responsibility to do what's right. It's been a very challenging time for all of us, of course, in terms of what's happening and what's likely to continue to happen. At the same time, we have a responsibility to be part of the solution, and many of the platforms we are strategic partners with, as I'm sure most of the CMOs in the call are as well, and therefore trying to find solutions in these highly complex situations which squares with our principles and what we stand for, but also enables the good of these platforms, because I think they do a lot of good in the world as well. It has been our mission, and I think I would argue we got that about right. We'll make a big thing of it. We did pause some of our investments. We worked through the GARM with a number of other big players to find some solutions to have more transparency, more auditing, more control. And we're now comfortable with the roadmaps that are in place, and we'll continue to drive that. So I think being part of the solution, but of course that comes with, back to your point around choices, because arguably that put a societal choice before a profit choice, frankly. And we saw some declines in some of our digitally native businesses as a consequence of that decision. Sort of proves the point that the platform works, I guess you could argue. It's a very good alpha beta test, but genuinely, this internally, these are difficult conversations around what's right. Profit versus principles, and in this case, again, I'm proud to say I think we did the right thing. It came at some profit cost, but again, the long run, and importantly, retaining our partnerships and being part of the solution is important. So that's how I would articulate the answer.
Yeah. Well, so you said it's about, rightfully so, about balancing these objectives, profits versus principles. What's your biggest regret? And I could phrase it differently. What's your biggest learning from things you've done? You said, well, we really shouldn't have done it that way.
Personal learning?
No, in making those choices, those tough choices between principles and profits.
I think the learning, which actually probably goes back to the brilliance of the founders of the business, is to take the long-term decision, even though it's probably very hard and it requires real courage. And honestly, I talk to John Mars now, which I do regularly, as you can imagine, giving me advice. It's still inspiring how he and the rest of the family, but he can still see the long term and guide for what's right for the future, and take some bold moves which are difficult. And of course, I'm, along with my team, trying to manage a very difficult P&L and how to drive the best value for the shareholders as well. And I think the learning is go faster on the long term. Easy said. So then the question is, how do you do that? And I think the how to is back to that connecting the dots, back to that test and learn, back to that placing some bets, which maybe don't cost a fortune, but you can prove whether they're working and give confidence to the organization, and then scale them when they do work. So I think it's a regret, but it's a reminder that you've got to take that long-term perspective and place those test and learns as quickly as possible to then scale them. When I reflect back over the 2 years, it's probably examples. I wish I'd have done more of that. I wish I'd have put more money there. I wish I'd have driven that a bit harder, because of course, the more you plant those seeds, the quicker you can harvest the benefits down the line. And I'm very self-reflective and self-critical of, I should have gone faster there. Should have put more money there. Should have been bolder there. Should have moved resources quicker there. That's the sort of, and that's a good reminder. So when the next one comes up, be stronger, be bolder.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I guess this comes very much down to real leadership. How do you describe yourself as a leader? How would you describe yourself as a leader?
It's always better for other people to describe you as a leader, I guess, rather than yourself.
Well, how do you think others describe you as a leader?
Um, I don't know. I think the things that are important to me. I would describe myself as a leader that continues to learn. That's what's most important for me. I'm passionate about learning. I guess in my early career, I was learning to lead, and now I'm sort of leading to learn and being curious and trying to be as future orientated as possible, and building a team that can help to navigate these very complex times. So that's sort of the heart of me. Secondly, I do have a real passion for building great teams, great talent, and thirdly, all in service, as I mentioned before, of a legacy. So how to build something, a business that is better than the one that I inherited with my team, and I can build a team that and a culture and a business that I'm proud to hand over to somebody else to take it to the next level. I know that maybe sounds a little cliched, but for me, the most important thing is learning and continuing to learn.
It's interesting. I the other day I read a book by Bob Chapman. It's called Everybody Matters. He is I think the CEO or the founder, maybe even Barry Waymiller, which is a pretty large company. And his philosophy is that like the title suggests, that every employee matters, and that there is no such thing as somebody who can't fit the company. It's all about creating the right space, condition, and context, and then everybody will blossom.
Exactly.
I floated that idea with some venture capitalists, and they were, as you can imagine, like, no, if it doesn't work, immediately kick the person out. That's better in the long run for everybody. Where are you on that scale?
I think the most important thing I can do is to create the environment. Real clarity of strategic vision, where we're going. Create the environment and then build that team. And of course, in building that team, that invariably means some changes. I mean, I've made a significant amount of change in my current team, but I'm very proud of the team that I've now got 2 years later. And what we're trying to achieve, a blend of promotions internally, a blend of hires externally, a balanced team, gender and geography and ethnicity, and a team, I think, that can take us through to the next level. So I think the most important responsibility for me is to build the team and to create the environment. So, that does mean at times changing players and blending a team that's ready for the next phase. I mean, I'm a very different leader to my predecessor. He did a brilliant job integrating Mars and Wrigley together. And probably time for me to come in and bring a different momentum and dimension, and there'll be a time for somebody else to take the business forward as well. And I think that's the mindset, really, of creating the environment where people can be at their best and confront the reality of what we're all facing, be decisive through those times, and create something that's better.
Yeah, well, hard to argue. I think we're almost at the end, Andrew. And I was just thinking, if there's one thing that you would want people to take away from this, investing an hour of their Friday in listening to us, what would that be?
I would probably go back to my learning point, and I would say, be obsessively curious. Every interaction that you have, every individual you speak to, even the people you don't get on with, what can you learn? What can you do to take yourself to the next level, and then continue to reinvent?
Great. And so what did you learn in this conversation?
Oh, crikey. Good question. I'll be reflecting on that back to where we were. I think the good thing about these conversations is just the ability to talk with somebody hopefully like-minded about what's possible. And again, it makes me think about the audience that's out there and the brilliance that's in other businesses, and a reflection of telling the Mars story is one thing, but what can we learn as well from the Institute of Real Growth? What can we learn from others as well? So, proudly tell the Mars story, but there's also brilliance elsewhere. So how do we blend the brilliance between us to create a a better world for the future.
Yeah, great. Well, Andrew, thank you very much. It was a very open and honest conversation. Undoubtedly, people took a lot more out than just the point you made about learning. I did for sure. So thank you. To the viewers, this was the first one since summer pause. Next week, I'm talking to somebody with a very different profile, Elena Rosenfeld. She's the founder and CEO of Kicking Horse Coffee. And Kicking Horse Coffee is a much smaller business, but she has been bought, or her business has been bought by Lavazza because of a extremely clearly articulated and more than articulated, implemented purpose of that business, and she totally embodies it. One of the most inspirational person I met in the last year. She was in our program as well, so hopefully you'll be there next week. I want to thank you for your questions, great, sometimes difficult questions, and I wish everybody a lovely end of the day and a great weekend. And thank you, Andrew.
Thanks, Frank. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.